welcome today to Teaching Through the Bible. I hope you guys are having a great day as we begin talking about now the grain offering today. So we talked last time about the whole burnt offering and what that was. This time, before we get into the next offerings, I want to make sure that I make real clear kind of what's going on here and what's not going on here. So in the ancient Near East in general, so this could be the Philistines, it could be the Syrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. There's a lot of different groups of people in the ancient Near East. And this would probably extend to just in general when you see a bunch of sacrifices, this kind of thing in a culture. But certainly in the ancient Near East, the goal here was you're essentially kind of maybe feeding the god. You are doing something though that is to get something out of it. You want something out of this. So let's say you're about to be planting your crops. You want to make sure that you have a good season for your crops. Then you go and you sacrifice to the fertility gods. And maybe you'll sacrifice in their culture to Baal, who's the god of like rain, and you want to make sure you got enough rain so that your crops grow. And he has this goddess with him who's like a fertility goddess that's supposed to make things grow. Well, let's sacrifice some things to her. You're kind of trying to essentially bribe them, like, hey, I'll give you this, and you give me good crops. That's what I want out of this. So you're going to them so that you can get something out of it. It's a transaction in that way. And that is pretty much widespread. That's how things were. But in the Bible, then we see something very different. That's not what's going on in the Bible. It's very easy to get confused on that. Like if you are someone who reads into like a lot of studies on stuff, a lot of what happened in the ancient Near East, and to just assume, well, that's kind of what they did. That's how they related to gods, and so we just kind of put those two together. A lot of scholars will sometimes, they'll say this is how things went back then, and so that's what's going on here. But if we're really paying attention, the Bible is actually the opposite of that. It's not, I'm going to do something for you, and then I get something out of it. Right? We've already seen that in the first couple books of the Bible, that in fact it's the other way around. Right? God did something for them already. God has already done so much for them. God has already blessed them in so many ways. And now this is their response. God's already, we saw in Exodus, he saved them. He brought them out of that land of slavery from the Egyptians. He got them across the Red Sea, destroyed the Egyptian army, and just so much more even before that in Genesis. We saw so many things that God did for Abraham, for Isaac, for Jacob, for Joseph, all these things that God has already done as he has taken care of his people. And then they make this covenant as a nation with God. There was already the Abrahamic covenant that continued on through his line, but now we have this covenant of the nation of Israel with God. And that all comes after God does for them so many things, including, again, saving them from the slavery of the Egyptians. And so they are now free from that. And God says, now that I've already done these things, here's what I expect of you. What he expects of them is not what gets them all that stuff. They've already got it. And the same for us. We can trust in Jesus and like he's died for us and he saves us from our sins, and it doesn't work the other way where like we have to, okay, well, as long as I can do A, B, C, and D, then I can be worthy of Jesus accepting me. We'll never be worthy in that sense. We can never do enough. But Jesus doesn't say you have to do enough. He says, I already did it. And so now you do this. Because I already did this for you, now here's your response. And so that's what's going on here. The sacrifices are their response. This is what they should be doing. But this is pointing forward to what Jesus is going to do. And so they can trust in what Jesus is going to do. They can see what God has already done. But this isn't so that they can get something out of it. This is not, hey, I'm going to give this sacrifice so I can get something out of it. So we've got to make sure that we have the right mindset as we're looking at these sacrifices, because the way that God told his people to do things was so frequently just the reverse, just very different from how all these other cultures did stuff. And that's a big thing in Leviticus is going to be, hey, you have to be set apart from these other cultures. You have to do things differently from these other cultures. We saw back in Exodus, there was that command to not boil a goat in its mother's milk, and that was something that other cultures did, and that's probably something saying, hey, don't do this ritual. Don't worship in the ways that the other cultures worship. He said, don't make an image. God says, don't make an image of me and worship that. Why? Well, that was a problem because that's what other cultures did. They would worship the image and say, this image that we're worshiping, this is our God. It's actually connected intrinsically somehow to this deity. So God is telling them being very different, and the way they do sacrifices is no different from that, in the sense that the way they do sacrifices, it's going to be very, very stark contrast from what they do and their reasons versus what everyone else is doing and their reasons. So as we move on to the next thing after the whole burnt offering, we come to the grain offerings. Now, the grain offering here, actually the Hebrew word mincha is it's a word for gift. It's an offering in this case, so like a religious sense, like as they're doing it as a sacrifice. It's this grain offering here is a fine way to translate this, but it can also be translated in other contexts as gift. And so we can think of this somewhat as a gift, right? This is a gift to God. Now, everything is God's. God owns everything. We truly don't own anything ourselves. We are the stewards of what God has given us. But with the grain offering, then it isn't something where he commands it for example, like we're going to look next time at sin offerings, right? This is not something where, okay, well, I sinned, and so God says, since I sinned, I have to do this. You might do a grain offering for an offering of first fruits, so you should do it at that time. The first fruits is going to be when you have your crops come in, and then the first of your crops you give. But there's, I think, a little more flexibility as far as like being able to just give this as something that you want to give, just because hey, I want to give this to God, right? And we'll see that with the peace offerings as well that come up next. So you have grain offerings, you have peace offerings, and we'll just see at the beginning that it says in chapter 2, Leviticus chapter 2, the very first verses here kind of give us a little overview of it. When anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to Yahweh, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. And he shall take from it a handful of the fine flour and oil with all of its frankincense. And the priest shall burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of Yahweh's food offerings. So you have here a number of differences between this and the last sacrifice we saw. First of all, really clearly, there's no blood. I referenced this back when we were talking about Cain and Abel, how some people say, well, Abel offered a sacrifice with blood. Cain's didn't have blood. That was the problem with Cain. Clearly not, because we have things like grain offerings. There's also drink offerings, which aren't going to be mentioned here, but that can be just taking something and pouring it out before on the altar before God. And in these cases, there's no blood. So very big difference here. And a lot of times a grain offering may have come alongside another offering, like a whole burnt offering. And so then you're still having the blood process. But this offering itself is not a bloody sacrifice. Then on top of that, what else do we see? That this offering it doesn't say burn it all up. In fact, you just give a memorial portion of it. So you give this one part that you give it all to the priests. And this will always be the case where you have to go through the priest. You can't just do this yourself. You go to the priests, and they are the ones who are giving the offering to God. So that's a significant thing as well, just to notice that in all of these things, the priests must be involved. You can't do it on your own. You need a priest in order to have contact with God like this. And of course, that lets us know, as we talk about Jesus later, Jesus as our great high priest, we got to have the priest. He is that priest. And the priest here, actually, in verse 3, it says the rest of the grain offering. So you gave it to the priest. He took a bit of it, and that goes on the fire. That goes on the altar. Then the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. And so this is a way that God provides for his people doing the ministry. Because you bring this offering, and unlike the burnt offering, you give it to them, they take it, all goes up. It's the going up offering, right? It all goes up in smoke. This one, you give it to them, they take a little bit, that goes on the altar, that goes to God, and the rest, the way that God accepts it is that it goes to the people doing the job of the ministry. It goes to his priests. And this is how they're provided for, because this was their job. And unlike other people maybe they had an agricultural kind of job. Maybe they grew crops. Maybe they were shepherds. They could have another job that provided them with food for their family. This job, it doesn't do that in the same way, right? They're not necessarily, they can't spend as much time growing crops because they're busy doing these sacrifices so much. So these sacrifices, God provides this way for his priests, for the people doing this ministry, to be provided for. So they actually get a portion of this, and that's for the families of the priests. So then, and it says for Aaron and his sons, so that's specifically the priests. There are going to be some places where you have something that indicates like any Levite. Here's how a Levite was provided for. But when it says Aaron and his sons, that's specifically the priests. Aaron was a Levite, but Levi was the tribe he was a part of. But then there are many other people in that tribe that weren't descendant from Aaron. And so those are generally the Levites, and then Aaron and his sons, that's the priestly line. So this is one way they're provided for. So we see that in the provision that God is giving them. We see there's no blood. And we also see that in this grain offering, no yeast, no honey. The yeast, at least, that we see throughout the Bible can be a representation of sin. And so when it says no yeast, this could be symbolic for, this is a physical thing that's pointing to something spiritual. And perhaps this here is saying, when you say no yeast in the sacrifice, this is no sin, right? And Jesus, the greatest sacrifice, had no sin. He needed to be a sacrifice without sin. So we also see something else that is required. So that's something that's required not to have. This is something required to have, is salt. And it mentions the salt of the covenant. Well, what was salt used for back then? Here we just use it in today's culture in America for like flavoring, or for just dumping a ton of it on something and, making our blood pressure levels go up and stuff. It's a very different kind of mindset towards salt than what they had then, because we have refrigerators. If you want to keep something good, you want to keep it from expiring, you put it in the fridge. At least for a while, you're going to be good to go. For them, they didn't have that. They would salt things, and salt was a preservative. It's a very important preservative. And so perhaps this salt of the covenant is indicating, this term that's indicating the longevity of the covenant, how the covenant is continuing, how the covenant is not expiring. And so since they have salt on all of their sacrifices, this could have to do with the preservation of the sacrifice, how this is a continuing thing, how it's not something that's, I guess maybe say something that's a decaying thing. It is in its best condition. And so the salt here, it's not really explained out what the purpose is, but just by knowing what they used salt for back then, we maybe can get an idea of why it is that salt had to be in all of these sacrifices. And so with that, we've seen what goes on with the grain offering. We're going to get an idea of what the peace offerings are in our next section. We'll run out of time today, but we'll talk about that right before leading on into the sin offerings. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.